In the 1880s, the balance of Palestine's sparse population began to change, with a significant influx of Jews fleeing from the pogroms in Russia. Increasing anti-Semitism in Europe saw the birth of the Zionist movement, led by Theodor Herzl, whose aim was to bring about the formation of a Jewish state in Palestine. Although Herzl never lived to see his dream fulfilled, the First World War brought the beginning of its realization. At the same time, an Arab nationalist movement within the Ottoman Empire was beginning to emerge.
This was Arab nationalism. It was Arabs against the Turks. It was Arabs wherever they were living, but particularly in the Middle East. I mean, when you go beyond into North Africa, you have some Arabs, you have Berbers and so on as well. But so this was very Arab nationalism. Nobody had any thoughts of Palestinian nationalism at that time whatever, because there was no such place as a state of Palestine. There never had been. So nobody had gone for generations thinking, I'm a Palestinian.
At the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, the Turkish Ottoman Empire sided with the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Germany against France, Russia, and the British Empire. Great Britain, together with her allies from Australia, New Zealand, and troops from across the British Empire, fought against the Turks, who were backed by the Germans. As the war on the Eastern Front progressed, both the British and French governments started to consider how the Ottoman Empire would be divided up in the event of its defeat. Where would the aspirations of the Zionist movement fit into it? And where would the Arab nationalist movement fit into it? In 1915, the British High Commissioner in Egypt, Sir Henry McMahon, entered into correspondence with Sharif Hussein of Mecca.
Letters were exchanged between representatives of the British government and Arab leaders, more specifically the Hashemites in Arabia. These letters, referred to as the McMahon-Hussein correspondence, involved commitments by the British to support a movement that would lead to the independence of Arab states. There's no doubt that these commitments were made. There were question marks as to the scope of the commitments, but these letters were not public. They were private, confidential exchanges between the British and the Arabs.
The deal with Sharif Hussein had no legal validity. It was just only exchange of letters. In order to make it legally valid, you have to make a contract, you have to make a deal, you have to make an agreement by both parties. Here it was just an exchange of letters without inconclusive correspondence, and more disagreements than agreements, actually.
McMahon himself made it perfectly clear. First is in a letter to John Shuckburgh, he wrote about this that it was fully my intention to exclude Palestine as it was to exclude the more northern coastal tracts of Syria. And he's talking about two parts of Syria, and he wanted to exclude the southern part. Even later, that was in 1922, 1937, he wrote a letter to the Times, and he said, I felt it my duty to state, and I do so definitely and emphatically, that it was not intended by me in giving this pledge to King Hussein to include Palestine in the area in which Arab independence was promised. I also had every reason to believe, at the time, that the fact that Palestine was not included in my pledge was well understood by King Hussein. Now, you can argue against that, but can you really argue against the man who wrote the letter?
And then, in 1960, there were other commitments, this time made between the British, the French, and the Russians. These agreements referred to as the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And they decided to allocate and distribute rights in respect to the very same territories. None of them had the power of disposition in international law. So it's important to know that these agreements were made. The Sykes-Picot in particular was a secret agreement, and that it had an impact later on the borders of what became Palestine and the borders of Lebanon and Syria, because the French always reminded the British of the prior agreements, but they were not binding legal instruments in international law.
In late 1916, the Allied forces, known as the Egyptian Expeditionary Force, were nearing El Arish and the border with Palestine, thus ensuring a sufficient buffer zone against any further Turkish and German aggression against the Suez Canal. By this time, a new Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary took office. David Lloyd George and Lord Arthur Balfour replaced Asquith and Grey. Both came into power, and both of them wanted to take the land of Israel. They wanted to make a big buffer zone to make sure that in the future no rival European power was ever going to come in and cut or thwart Britain's link from herself, from Britain, through to the Eastern Empire.
The military campaign to capture Palestine from the Turks that continued through 1917 was beleaguered by one defeat after another. At home, the British government was considering the aspirations of the Zionist movement, which led to the Balfour Declaration.
The Balfour Declaration is truly a defining moment of history. Why? Because a number of years earlier, the Zionist movement, which took off as a result of the initiatives of Herzl, first his very important document under the name of the Jewish State, where he was looking for a solution to the Jewish problem. This document really is the beginning of the story. To understand the importance of the Balfour Declaration, we've got to go back to him. And his proposal, his solution was, we need to end the homelessness of the Jews. We need a home. We need a state. And then he had this conference in Basel, Switzerland in 1897, brought together 200 prominent Jews from around the world and did something rather miraculous. He got them to unite. The history in Europe of what the Jewish people went through is horrendous. It is persecution, it is massacres, pogroms, expulsion from countries. It take a long time to even summarize what the Jewish people went through. And there were leaders in Great Britain who were courageous and were prepared to make a decision which was a noble decision, because it was time to act justly. It was time to repair these wrongs. When the British government, with the help and support of the United States, of France, of Italy, decided that we're going to uphold and support this policy regarding the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine, everything changed.
On the 31st of October 1917, as the War Cabinet met here in Whitehall to decide the final wording of what became known as the Balfour Declaration, unbeknown to them at that moment, the Allies won their first victory in the campaign to liberate Palestine from the Turks. Earlier that day, the British and New Zealand forces paved the way for the epic charge of the Australian Light Horse to take the historic town of Beersheba. It was one of the last horse-mounted charges in the history of warfare. The news of the victory in Beersheba reached London on the day that the letter from Lord Balfour to Lord Rothschild was signed on the 2nd of November 1917.
His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done.
The fall of Beersheba into Allied control paved the way for the conquest of Jerusalem and to bring the ancient Jewish homeland under British rule. A year later, on 31st of October 1918, the Turkish Ottoman Empire surrendered to the Allies. The surrender of the Germans and the Austro-Hungarian Empire followed shortly after that.